Hey, it's Cate with Yogahealer, and I'm going to solo cast today an episode on what's going on if you are not bouncing back as quick as you used to. Because a lot of people just associate that with getting older, and that's a bit of a dangerous association. I would associate that with your level of chronic inflammation. And so in today's podcast, I'm going to get a little bit into two different studies, one on chronic inflammation at large, global population study, and then another that is linking COVID, the seriousness of symptoms, how lethal is it, to chronic inflammation. So we're going to talk a little bit about bounce back and really what's at stake. And my hope is that in talking about this, that you have a better understanding of how to improve your bounce back. And whether that's bouncing back in life, bouncing back after a setback, whether that's just recovery from hard workouts and strenuous exercise, bounce back from stressful life events, stressful projects at work. We'll also talk a little bit about recovery in general, like if you've gone through a hard time, how to bounce back a bit faster. All right, so there's a lot going on with the assumption that these are things that we can't affect, when truly it is. If it's directly linked, if your bounce back is directly linked to how much chronic inflammation there is in your body, you can affect chronic inflammation. So that's what we really want to look at. In Ayurveda, chronic inflammation is ama. It's that which can't be digested. And the way that I look at it is it falls into two camps: that which can't be digested by the mind, or that which can't be digested by the body. And it's not really what can't be digested, it's that which isn't being digested. Why? Usually because there's just too much coming in. There's just too much coming in to be able to process. There's too much information or emotion coming in for the mind to process, or there's too much undigestible food, or just too much food coming in for the body to be able to digest, for the cells to be able to not just like digest, but actually eliminate, right? So if there's more stuff that can come in than you can make use of or get rid of, there's a backup. And that backup shows up in the mind in terms of negative emotions: fear, irritability, and depression, right? And you could say those are the three categories: vata, pitta, kapha. The energy that moves things and is excitable can turn to fear. The energy that's directed and gives us direction in life, that turns into irritability. And the energy that gives us a groundedness in life, that when that gets too heavy, that turns to depression. So just ask yourself, do I chronically have any of these emotional patterns? And if so, which one? Just get curious. Like, which way do you go? I personally go to irritability. Yes, indeed. Other people go more to anxiety, overwhelm. That's more on the vata side. And stress is going to go more to that side, although stress combined with workaholism will go both wind and fire, more of that pitta, that intensity. So fear plus irritability. Yeah, lovely. And the heaviness side, that's more of like where you're complacent, interestingly enough. Like this overwhelm goes to depression, but it's a different kind of compression than like complacency going to depression. So the true kapha type of depression is more of the complacency. And it doesn't, like, how much does this categorization really matter? It does and it doesn't. Like, it does with greater specificity. I have a good Ayurvedic constitutions workshop. If you want to learn more about that, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Okay, let's talk a bit about typical body stuff then. Body with ama is when there's more coming in than can be digested and eliminated. It's, to me, there's just a global disrespect of space and, to some degree, time, right? But space first, then time second. So what do I mean by there's a global disrespect for space? We don't realize that there is a space and a time around digestion. And that what that is a time off. So if things are always on, they break down. If things are chronically breaking down and there's not time to repair them, they get worse and more broken over time. And that's what chronic inflammation is. So I'm going to read a little bit from this study on chronic inflammation. And this was let me just scroll up here. So this is from Chronic Inflammation by Roma Pawa and his gang. All right, this was released in November 2020. I'll put the link to the show notes. It's on the NIH. And what it says, what the study came to the conclusion of, and this is significant, especially if you're wanting your bounce back, right? Because you're designed to have bounce back. Chronic inflammatory diseases are the most significant cause of death in the world. The World Health Organization ranks chronic diseases as the greatest threat to human health. The prevalence of diseases associated with chronic inflammation is anticipated to increase persistently for the next 30 years in the United States. I'm going to get into that later. In 2000, the year 2000, nearly 125 million Americans were living with chronic conditions and the chronic inflammatory conditions he's talking about. And 61 million, or 21% of the population, had more than one. Just a side note there, in Ayurveda, by the time you get to a diagnosable condition that they're talking about here, you've had symptoms, you've lost your bounce back for a good long while. It doesn't happen overnight. You might not have been paying attention to the subtle signs and symptoms and just pushing through them or living with them. Okay, so 61 million, or 21% of the population that is spreading, and now I'm going to do another little editorial side note. America sets the standard for what's trending globally. So this is significant that 20 years ago, 1 in 5 Americans had more than one chronic inflammatory disease. In recent estimates, I'm back to reading now, in recent estimates by Rand Corporation, in 2014, nearly 60% of Americans had at least one chronic condition, and 42% had more than one, and 12% had 5 or more chronic conditions. Worldwide, 3 of 5 people die due to chronic inflammatory diseases like stroke, chronic respiratory diseases, heart disorders, cancer, obesity, and diabetes. Now, why is this study grabbing my attention, and why should it grab yours? It's actually a book. I'm reading the brief on the book. So this is so freaking important, right? If we're now understanding that stroke, heart disease, including all cardiovascular disease, respiratory diseases, cancer, obesity, diabetes, are chronic inflammatory diseases, and chronic inflammation is optional and it's projected to get worse. And if we look at the United States as the trendsetter, we see that in the last 20 years, it's gotten significantly worse. Then we should pay attention because it's projected to get increasingly persistent for the next 30 years. And it's not like you feel better every day, right? You feel worse every day. It's not like you're feeling good and then you get a scary diagnosis. It's like you're slowly feeling worse and then you get a scary diagnosis. And then if you don't change, you get another scary diagnosis on top of your first scary diagnosis. And if you're like 12% of adults right now in the United States, you have 5 or more of those scary diagnoses. And that, when treated by medication, is a lot of medication. All right, so let's talk a little bit. I'm going to tie this to COVID because this is important about the chronic respiratory disease part of all this. So this is from a study, May 2020, COVID-19, the inflammatory link and the role of nutrition in possible mitigation. Global public health bodies and governments have ignited strategies and issued advisories on various hand washing and hygiene guidelines, social distancing strategies, and in the most extreme cases, some countries have adopted stay-in-place or lockdown protocols to prevent COVID-19 spread. Notably, there are several significant risk factors for severe COVID-19 infection. These include the presence of poor nutritional status and pre-existing non-communicable diseases, NCDs, such as and here's the same list that you just heard, such as diabetes mellitus, chronic lung diseases, cardiovascular diseases, obesity, and various other diseases that render the patient immunocompromised. These diseases, now listen closely, are characterized by systemic inflammation, which may be a common feature of these NCDs, affecting patient outcomes against COVID-19. So I'll put the link to this study as well. So we've known for many, many moons about the connection between how severe someone's symptoms will be if they have chronic inflammation when they come into contact with COVID versus someone who doesn't have chronic inflammation that comes into contact with COVID. And that study is great. They really go into it. And there's more studies like that. So when we talk about bounce back, to me, it's not like, what are some of the beginning signs of chronic inflammation that we want to start to become more aware of? So some of the most basic ones, weight gain. If you're carrying more weight than your body's designed to, and if you were in good shape in high school, like that's a good body weight usually, is like where you were at between 18 and 22 when your body was done growing. So earlier for girls than for boys. If you were at your ideal body weight then, well, fascinatingly enough, if you're say over 50 or over 60, you should probably be a little lighter than then, because as the body ages, it becomes more efficient and muscle becomes leaner. Not much, but a little bit, right? But if you're heavier than that, then you know that you have chronic inflammation, which means that the way that you're eating and metabolizing and resting, that rest part of the face, that is off, that you need to make changes. You need to make lifestyle changes and diet changes. And if you do, you'll get your bounce back. Yay! All right. So what else? Body pain. So joint pain, arthritis, all of that is a symptom of chronic inflammation. Or it's actually a sign. Chronic fatigue and insomnia. So if you're tired and you're not sleeping well, if you're consistently getting less sleep, if you're consistently having more interrupted sleep, if you're having trouble falling asleep, if you're having trouble getting up in the morning, those are all signs of chronic inflammation. GI problems, so problems in your gut, like constipation, diarrhea, acid reflux, any of those means that there's something wrong with digestion and elimination. So you want to think about these things, in my experience, as simply as you possibly can, right? Don't make it more complex. It actually kind of bummed me out when I saw in the COVID article, like, why do we have to call non-communicable diseases NCDs? Like, why do we have to make this more complicated? Why do we have to name things that are in a more complicated way? The benefit of simplicity in language is that you can find out where you are on the map. And you want to know, like, where are you right now on the map of chronic inflammation? How much do you have? Because the less of it you have, the less life throws you for the loop. And the easier it is to bounce back from the intensity that occasionally life, or sometimes consistently, life will offer up to you. So, for instance, if you're not bouncing back after setbacks or failures or stress or workouts, or even, say, a fun night out on the town where you drank a little bit too much and ate a little too much and you were train wrecked from that for 48 hours or a week, that's your bounce back. And you can get your bounce back. All right, frequent infections. Another sign of chronic inflammation. Now, Ayurveda is going to go even more in depth in this in terms of signs of ama. So signs of ama might even precede signs of chronic inflammation, which is good news, which means like you can tell at even a subtler state, meaning it doesn't have to get to chronic inflammation to know if you have ama. So what is ama? Ama is that which is not being digested in the body or the mind. It usually starts in the body, in the digestive tract. Okay, so I'm going to read you a few of the signs of ama. And if you have these are just and you don't have any of those things that are chronic inflammation yet, right? You might see like, oh, I'm on the way. I'm on the way there. So I might as well change directions now before it's harder. So one of the first ones is my tongue is coated, especially in the morning. Now, you might not know if your tongue is coated until you start using a tongue scraper. And fair enough. If you grew up in a culture that doesn't scrape their tongues, then it's time to create that culture at home. So go get a tongue scraper. They're now sold everywhere, which is so freaking exciting because before they were hard to get. In the morning when you wake up, scrape your tongue before you brush your teeth and just see how much coating is there. And then you can scrape your tongue later in the day just to see, does the coating go away or does it come back? You're really supposed to just scrape your tongue every morning before brushing your teeth so that you can actually stimulate the organs of digestion and elimination. Okay, question number 2. Do you have real appetite? Meaning, like, do you let yourself get really hungry? Not emotionally hungry, but like really physically hungry, where you feel the chicken scratching sensation in your stomach. Like, wow, I could eat anything right now. I'm hungry for anything right now. Because that's the difference between that and emotional eating. Emotional eating is like, I want this exactly very specific thing that makes me feel this very specific way, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about having real appetite. So if you don't have real appetite, then you have AMA, which means you're on the track to not bouncing back even less quickly in the future. And you're on the track for chronic inflammation, which we now know all those major disease categories that people are dying from are chronic inflammation. Okay. Do you need to spit? So if you find yourself spitting a lot, do you feel heavy in your body? These are all signs of AMA. That you're easily mentally or physically tired, or that you have trouble concentrating. In the morning, if you feel cloudy or groggy, if it's hard to get out of bed. If you feel a sense of blockage in the body, and this can be like you're just not pooping that easily, you don't feel that connected to your body, which is, oh boy, it's like if you don't know what that feels like because you're so in it, it's hard to know what actually feeling connected to your body is like. So I'll just give an example. Indy and I got, we got in Winston, we flew in to Puerto Vallarta 2 days ago. And she re-injured herself within like 20 minutes of touching ground because she wasn't that connected in her body. There was actually, and that often happens with air travel. And so getting into your body, there's things that you can do like self-massage, like exercise, like fasting. Those are like, to me, the fastest and easiest ways to get more connected to your body. Also taking laxatives if you're constipated, like magnesium, like Calm, just to move energy physically through waste products down and out. All right, feeling that something's not working right in your body is another sign of AMA. Feeling lazy, like you've lost your inclination to work or to push yourself harder, to do harder things, that's a sign of AMA. All right, so a few other ones. If your skin is breaking out a lot, if you feel pain or weakness in your calves or in your legs, if you have hyperacidity or nausea, if you're increasingly sensitive to different foods, and if you lack mental and emotional energy, like you just kind of like your give a shitter's given up, all of those are signs that you have AMA. Now, AMA just doesn't happen as like a one-time thing. It's as a pattern. So the real question we should be asking ourselves is like, exactly what is the anti-inflammatory diet and lifestyle? And my guess is, if you've been paying attention to health and wellness for any period of time, is you know. The question is, are you doing that? Like, are you doing what you know to do? And that's always people's edge. It's everybody's edge. It's not personal. It's everybody's edge, is to actually habituate or make a habit of, an automated habit of that which you know will create a better future outcome. So these habits, we have to realize, like, we are in a culture of complacence. We are in a culture of chronic inflammation. And what that means is, like, whatever culture you're in, it's hard for the fish to know it's swimming in the water, because the habits of our culture are leading us to chronic inflammation, which is leading us to having less of a bounce back, which is leading us to chronic disease, which will kill us, and it's projected to get worse, right? It's pretty clear. We want to be increasingly aware of where there are cultures that are anti-inflammatory, because we want to normalize our habits, and habits are largely created by the groups we're in. They're largely created by other people. So if your family has a habit, like mine did growing up, of eating late at night, it's hard to know that eating late at night is what's causing the sleep issues and the constipation or digestive issues and the coating on the tongue and the hard to get out of bed in the morning, or the feeling bloated all day. It's hard to know that those are just caused by what's normal in the household, of saying eating later is normal in the household. And later would just honestly be past dark is how it's defined in Ayurveda. Pretty aggressive definition there. But Ayurveda is very serious when it comes to, hey, have your bounce back your whole life. And there's certain rules that you've got to follow. And these rules are not made by humans. They're just made by nature, the nature that made us, the nature that created the circadian rhythm on this planet Earth, in which humans arose in, right? So we don't get to choose the rules. We get to observe the rules. And the better we observe the rules, which are just the laws of the universe, the better we observe those, the more we keep our bounce back, or the easier we can get our bounce back, meaning we can recover from life setbacks more easily. We can recover from strong, intense workouts more easily. I had a workout yesterday, and I hadn't done this in a while because I've been rehabbing my knee, cartilage in my knee and my ligaments after like years of injuries. The list goes on. And I hadn't been on a stand-up paddleboard in a while. I think it may be about a year. And I have it's a very long one. It's like a 12'6". It's a distance board. So it's not for catching waves, although my husband surfs it, which is absolutely hilarious. So we have two of these big long boards. And we paddled out, and it was a bit windy, which is pretty intense. You're basically like a sail on a paddleboard like that. And I was out for maybe 2 hours of distance paddleboarding. And I was wondering, I wonder if I'll be sore from that. And I'm not. So why not? Well, because I had been doing enough of the habits, simple habits, like Wim Hof breathing technique, which oxygenates your cells, like hydration, like intermittent fasting. So keeping my body light and leaner, and eating very good, easy to digest foods. So mostly vegetables and a little bit of beans and a little bit of hot sauce, because I'm in Mexico. And that's what you're supposed to do here. Recovery in general, it's interesting. Recovery from injuries. And I know a lot about this, and I know a lot about the need to slow down. And part of that is the need to digest all the experiences you've just gone through. So say, for instance, you ended up with an injury, or say you've been a workaholic for a while and you have burnout. I see this all the time. And you're like, how quickly can I get my bounce back? Well, it depends how deep in you are into the habits that are generating chronic inflammation. So for me, with healing an injury in my knee, it wasn't just about that. It was about healing some of the chronic inflammation due to doing too much and not sleeping that well. So when we're honest with ourselves and we understand that there's a very strong correlation between getting great sleep, and great sleep is one of the things that digests chronic inflammation. So if you're not getting great sleep, you've got to look at that. You've got to look at helping yourself develop a habit, which might mean changing your caffeine intake. It might be changing your dinner time. It might be changing your relationships at work, right? So that you can actually have a reasonable relationship with your work. These are really important things to do. If you find yourself trying to cram everything in before the end of the day, which might be between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. or whatever, or maybe even longer, and then you're having trouble sleeping, is because you're doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. You're out of sync with the law. In our Body Thrive course, the first 2 habits we do are earlier, lighter dinner, early to bed. And it takes people a while to automate these habits. There's 10 habits. We find it takes people a year to get a solid B- in their habits. And these people are actually often coming in fairly healthy, but still we're in a culture of chronic inflammation, right? And so reversing some of the trends of this culture, it's huge, it's hard. And often our family's in a culture of chronic inflammation as well. So we're setting our kids up for not having the bounce back. We're setting our kids up for not sleeping well, for not digesting well, for not handling stressors well, from having a buildup of stuff in their mind, right, that can't be digested or eliminated before more stuff comes in. And all of that leads to chronic inflammation. All right, so this is from the chronic inflammation book. Sleep longer. Overnight sleep, ideally 7 to 8 hours, helps stimulating human growth hormones and testosterone in the body to rebuild itself. So we need sleep. Other anti-inflammatory habits, some of the basic ones, I would say is intermittent fasting. I have an ebook on it. I have a course on it. I have a challenge on it. We'll put all the links to that in the notes. Yogahealer.com/the-challenge will get you started. And it's a 21-day crash course in the anti-inflammatory habits, which I'm calling the wilder habits. Because what I see of the diseases of chronic inflammation are the diseases of complacency. It's the diseases of always choosing comfort. We're in a cult of comfort. And the problem with always choosing comfort in the short term, rather than discomfort in the short term, is it creates a nearer death and a lower quality of life day after day after day after day. So you want to get more in the cult of discomfort. And that's actually where yoga has lived the entire time. Yogis have been super aware for thousands of years. I think as have any really human beings that have been paying attention, that you want to have positive stressors on your system. You want to develop practices around positive stressors. And when you do that, you'll sleep well. So then the question is what are positive stressors? Well, one of the first positive stressors is fasting. It's just simply not overfeeding your mind with too much stimulation and too much activity and too much stress. And you might be saying to yourself, well, I can't choose that. I've got to take in everything I can. Listen to the last podcast with Glenna Bedoya I did on this, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Because in that, she realizes pretty quickly in 25 minutes of coaching how she could drastically reduce the intake of what's going into her earballs and her eyeballs. She could drastically take in less. And in doing so, she would free up her mind's ability to digest the stuff that's already there, including the emotions. The other fasting that we need to do is physical. We need to have at least, if you're an adult and you're not on your deathbed, 16 hours between the last calories you take in at the end of the day or sweet taste and the first calories you take in the next day. Now, messing around with that is a really good idea. So some days you fast 16 hours, 18 hours, 20 hours. Some days you do an OMAD or just one meal a day. Other days you might do fast mimicking diet days, depending on how much chronic inflammation you have and depending how serious you are about digesting it and eliminating it. You might do what we do in the challenge. We do a 5-day fast mimicking diet where you're having 500 or 600 if you're a guy, calories a day for 5 days. And some of you might be thinking, well, that sounds severe. It's what sounds more severe, that or cancer? Personally, to me, having less calories a few days, what happens is you start to feel really good. You start to feel light. You start to feel clear. You start to feel wow, I don't need to spend so much time in the kitchen. Wow, my food bill, if I just actually ate what my body could digest, would be cut in half. That's what one of our Body Thrivers who was doing the challenge realized. She's like, wow, being in Body Thrive and doing the challenge. Body Thrive, the course, the year-long course, it's $5,000. She realized in the challenge, which is, I think we're having a special offer to $147. She realized that her food bill for the year is cut in half. Right? It's dramatic. And that's not even including alcohol or other things that create chronic inflammation. All right, so doing the hard thing, practicing the hard thing until it's habituated. The yogis have a really lovely word for this. It's abhyasa, A-B-H-Y-A-S-A. And abhyasa is the practice. There's a yoga sutra that introduces 2 essential elements of yoga philosophy. And the Yoga Sutras were written 2,000 years ago. It's a good book, right? It's like the Bible. It's a good book. There's some really good books out there, and they're old, and they tell these truths that happened before social media was controlling our mind, right? Before the news was just so prevalent. Okay, Yoga Sutra 1.12 introduces two essential elements, abhyasa and viragyum. When practiced together, they serve as a spiritual and practical roadmap for navigating life. So let's talk a little bit about this. That's from a Yoga Journal article on Yoga Sutra 1.12 of abhyasa viragyam. The official sutra is abhyasa vairagyabhyam tannirodha. And tannirodha means doesn't cause fluctuations in the mind. So vairagyam is without, and this is so important, it's without attachment to the results. So in the beginning, when you're practicing and it's a practice, when you're practicing, because you haven't automated yet, it's a practice, which means it's going to be hard. It's going to be uncomfortable in the short term, more comfortable tomorrow, more comfortable in the long term. Is that Viragyum, this non-attachment to the results, is non-attachment to the results so that you can relax into the process. One of the best ways I've seen this drawn out is by James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits. And he talks about how in the beginning of changing a habit, there's going to be what's called the valley of disappointment. And this is where you're starting to intermittent fast, or you're starting to do some more of the wilder habits. And I'll talk more about those habits in chronic inflammation. You're starting to change your diet to eating things that are actually real foods for your body in that season, in the ecosystem in which you live. And you're starting to do things like perhaps play with cryotherapy of like getting your body cold, right? Cold water, cold plunging, cold showers, cryo tanks, like where you're actually exposing your body more to cold. That's one of the fastest and easiest ways, even though it might be psychologically hard at first, to move inflammation out, for your body to quickly digest it. So what happens is when you start to change your habits is you go through a period where what you think should happen and how good you should feel because you made a choice to do something different. Finally, you did the good thing. Is that it takes time for that to get traction, especially the deeper you're into the habit that was creating chronic inflammation. So he terms that in this plateau of latent potential. It's a diagram in Atomic Habit. It's great. And he said there's this latent potential, and in this plateau of latent potential, it feels like you've plateaued, like you're starting to do a new habit. At the beginning, you might feel kind of good, like, oh, it's making a difference. And then you might plateau. And what you think should happen is that you should be feeling a little bit better every day. But what actually happens is you feel disappointment. But if you keep doing the thing that's harder in the short term, what happens is all of a sudden you go past this tipping point. And in the tipping point, you start to feel way better than you thought you could. What I find is that this is where being in a community of people, being in a culture of people that have better habits than you is crucial. And that's why in our courses, people find that they can make progress more rapidly because more people around them have the habits that they want. So they're in a culture that's reinforcing the positive anti-inflammatory habits. You want the anti-inflammatory habits and lifestyle. If you don't, you will not get your bounce back. You will not feel as good. So let's talk about a few of the other things. So I'm going to go back to this chronic inflammation book, some of the obvious ones. And what was disappointing to me here was they got sleep right. They got weight right. Like you got to be at your ideal weight. They got anti-inflammatory foods right, which are basically like real foods that your body can digest, that's diverse and from they don't nail the ecosystem part. Instead, they give you a list of foods, but it's very, as far as I can tell, ecosystem driven. And they got less stress. So yay, good. They missed the fasting part, which shame on them. We know enough now about apoptosis and autophagy to know that cells need a break. We need to fast. When we break, what happens is cells start to digest the inflammation. And if a cell is too damaged to digest its own inflammation, it does this radical move called apoptosis. It commits suicide. It allows the body to just totally digest it. And then the whole physiology becomes more efficient. And this is one of my major arguments, is this is why your bounce back shouldn't get less as you age. A lot of people in our courses feel better in their 70s than they felt in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. I've seen it enough time to understand that the anti-inflammatory habits, what I'm calling these wilder habits, why? Because they're not complacent. They're not part of the cult of convenience, and they're not part of the cult of comfort. They're wild, and they make you feel alive, and they bring you into the seat of the creator in your life. And they bring you into a place where you can do hard things, because every day you wake up and you do the hard things. That's what leads to an anti-inflammatory experience. And that experience, you keep your bounce back. It might even improve. So significant. Okay, so good fats are clearly the only fats you should eat. And you know that. You already know that. You already know what it feels like to eat hydrogenated oils, mayonnaise, stuff like that, compared to like soaked almonds. They're not even in the same category in terms of nutrient density and being food for the body. Anything that stresses your body out in terms of digestion is creating inflammation. So, good fats, whether it's fatty fish like salmon or whether it's the good nuts that are soaked or pressed into oils, avocados, really important. Obviously, the greens, green things that are juiced or lightly steamed, right? It's easy to digest, marinated in salads are super great because they're enabling your body to pick up more oxygen and keep energy moving in, which helps move waste out. The other foods, don't you love how like berries and cherries have become so popular because they have this adaptogenic property. They're antioxidant, which means what? They're stopping this oxidation process, which is an inflammatory process from happening in your cells. This past summer, I harvested service berries, like 30 pounds. I bought a piece of land and had tons of service berry trees on it. And so I harvested service berries and more service berries. And I looked up, like, was there a nutritional profile on this? Because I'm eating these service berries, like literally by like the handful, by the pound. And like these things, and you can taste it. Wild foods taste wild. You can taste the antioxidants. You can taste your body getting smarter. And to me, this is like one of the most basic things to pay attention to is when you're eating your food, are you tasting your body getting dumber and more complacent and more bloated and more expansive? Are you tasting it getting smarter? And the wild taste will often taste a little bit constrictive, right? Where they're like, you feel your mouth doing these wild things. You feel your cells waking up. And you might be thinking like, I don't have access to wild foods. But what's interesting is like, when you start looking, you might, when you start paying attention to what's important, you start to notice that stuff showing up at your door. That's how it's been definitely for me. So for those of you who shop at organic food stores, you might just spend a little bit more time in the vegetable aisle and say like, what have I not tried here? Maybe it's a habanero pepper. Maybe it's fresh ginger root or fresh turmeric root. Maybe it's okra. Maybe it's green beans. You haven't had green beans in a while, right? So get just super curious about colors, foods with different colors, different antioxidants. Get super curious about that which is abundant in the season. Get curious about foods that have good fiber because they're part of the waste removal process in your body. Foods that you have to chew. So chewing is another like really great thing that helps slow the process of digestion and absorption down so that your body can actually get the nutrition out. So if you're noticing like, oh, my food's kind of disintegrate in my mouth, not good. All right. So the other question that I'm going to end this with in terms of stress and is your life on track is this is something I've noticed from writing the book Master of You, which came from leading a course that my course members and other courses were like, we need to understand how you seem to hit your goals continuously and without sacrificing like your body's health. Like what's going on there? How do you do that? And so we created Master of You based on the 5 elements of like, how do you live a bigger life? How do you live a life potent with meaning? I was quoting, I love this from it was from a Harvard lecture Jordan Peterson did like 20 years ago, over 20 years ago in the late 90s. And he said, what if a sense of meaning was an orienting reflex? What if a sense of meaning was an orienting reflex? That stopped me dead in the tracks because I was like, yeah, what if? Well, it is. A sense of meaning is an orienting reflex. So if you don't have meaning in your life, if you're not orienting to a life that means something to you, and that will always require you to do harder things. It will, like by definition. Tapas, or that friction of discriminating that this is where meaning lies for me and everything else is just filler, right? Just same thing with nutrition. Like this is true nutrition for me and everything else is just filler. These are good activities for my mind and everything else is just filler. Until we get to that level of what is meaning, we'll just fill our life with filler, and filler equals chronic inflammation. So that's what I'm going to leave, is just my question to you in terms of your purpose, in terms of purpose in the next chapter of your life. Feel it. It's like, are you orienting to your life of meaning? And if you're not, and if you haven't been in a while, then get in the challenge. We actually renamed it to Ignite Your Purpose Challenge. It's at yogahealer.com/the challenge. I didn't mean to turn this into a commercial for that, but I just want to help you. Like, we've had so many people, we had 300 people take this challenge and feel a lot better in 21 days, like really fast. Why? Because they start living the anti-inflammatory diet and lifestyle. They end up being in a culture of people with wilder habits. And the more you're living your wilder habits, your purpose comes in. You see it. You see it. And it's easier to live it because you're not carrying around all this inflammation. You're not centering your mind on all this distraction. All right. I hope this is helpful. If anything, I hope you now know that your bounce back should not go away with age. It should improve. Namaste and have a great day. Cate Stillman with the Yoga Healer podcast, signing off.